bar is that we move from the 22nd gate, we move to the 36th gate. This is the last gate in Pisces. It is the darkening of the light. It is the gate of crisis. It is the gate of fucking. It is a deep gate of desire. It is a gate of inexperience, looking for experience. So you're dealing with a very, very powerful experiential gate. The polarity of the 36 is the 6. Now, the 6th gate is really responsible for whether or not we are going to be opened or closed to others. It is the diaphragm that opens us up to intimacy. And the 6th gate is a deeply complex gate. It's related to the pH chemically in our body. But the reality is that out of the 6th gate, we have all the possible waves of the emotional system. In other words, whether we're dealing with the needs of the tribe, or we're dealing with the passion of the individual or the desire of the abstract collective, all of them have their root in the 6th gate and in its complexity. The 36-6 as a polarity, to begin with, means that all intimacy for us, whether we're going to be open to intimacy or not, is always being conditioned by whether it's going to be an exciting experience or not. That need for excitement in intimacy is at the root of this cross, the right angle cross of Eden. You know what I mean. In other words, that need for intimacy. You know, hey, apple, let's get it on. Let's do this. This is what it's about. Because if it's not going to be exciting, it's not going to be fun. So this cross of Eden, I gave you the light side. Give you a giggle first before I put on the heavy part of this. You get thrown out of Eden. That's the story. So you come in on this cross and you get thrown out of Eden. In other words, you have to go deep into the world. Going deep into the world, you'll see this fulfillment when we get to the end of this progression, because we'll get to the left angle cross of the plane. But what we're dealing with here in the right angle cross of Eden is that people who come in on this cross, they come in, their family is wealthy, they have all kinds of privilege. 6 months later, there's an accident, there's a death, there's a bankruptcy, there's something, and all of a sudden, Eden is lost. And in Eden being lost, they have to go out into the world and they have to find their knowledge and their own way. So people who come in on this cross often have an unexpected and often tragic beginning. In other words, certain protection, certain security, certain whatever is taken away from them. This is also at the psychological level. This is a very common cross for people who have their ideals shattered, at a very early age. The Eden is gone. The beauty and the simplicity and the innocence is lost. And this is a cross of loss of innocence. Go forth and multiply. Okay, I'm not innocent anymore. Let's multiply. Because that's what it leads to. In other words, it's really entering into the world. And it's so interesting that the moment you move from 22 to 36, you lose your grace, I mean, it's the joke, but it's true. You leave grace behind. You enter into the sexual maelstrom. You enter into all of that through entering into the cross of Eden, and out you go. And you go out because it turns you on, after all. You see, sex means everything to people who come in on this cross. Sex is very, very important to them. I mean, after all, it's the only thing they take with them that they got in Eden, They take their sex with them, and they try to refine their paradise through that sexuality. And of course, that leads to a great many dilemmas. However, in all of this, there's really magic. This is a very complex cross. And in the nature of this cross, when you get to the middle of the right angle structure, you get to the point where you have both the changing cross of introspection and the foundation cross of projection, you have the design sun earth and the 11-4 and the 12-4. Now the 11-4, 12-4 is one of the most important polarities that we have. That is that the 12-4 is the 12 being in the throat. The fourth line is the line of the prophet. This is the ability to raise the stagnant, or it's the voice in the wilderness. This is a great gate of articulation. This is the ability to mutate others, and in mutating others to actually truly be a prophet for the whole. The 11-4 is the great gate of teaching. This is Einstein, for example, was an 11-4. That is, the 11th gate is the gate of ideas, and in the fourth line we have the line of the teacher, very complex line that has 3 different planetary activations, 3 different kinds of teachers, ranging from, the teacher to the sage to the guru. So one of the things to recognize about this is that this is also an exploration of sexual intimacy in all of its possibilities. And it is also a way to teach it. It's also a way to expand it. I mean, after all, when you get to the 36th gate, up until then, sex looks a lot like dogs in a field. And by the time you get to the sun in the 36th gate, you have the ability to start writing the Kama Sutra. In other words, you've got a different kind of exploration here, and also the ability to turn sexuality into something greater. In other words, create tantric philosophy, or all these things that can try to elevate sexuality into something else. All of it has its beginnings coming out of this right angle cross of Eden. Now look, by entering into the world and being so involved in the sexual level of life, that when you get to the fixed aspect, what you get to is the juxtaposition cross of crisis. The 11 and the 12, the ideas, the ability to articulate disappears. What's in its place is aspects of the Sphinx. That is the 10th gate and the 15th gate. Pardon me, the vessel of love. We have the 10-1 and we have the 15-1, going along with the personality, sun and earth in the 36 and the 6. This crisis, it's a crisis over behavior. It's a real problem for these people. They come in on a cross that's highly dualistic. That the moment that they come in, there is a personality aspect that's deeply, deeply absorbed in its need for fulfillment through sexuality. To find the right sexual role. It doesn't have the 59, it's looking for it. To find the experience, it's finally going to be satisfying by looking for the 35. But now, instead of having the 11 and the 12 that says, wow, it's a great idea to make love in a canoe, and the 12 that writes a book about it and tells everybody else about it, make love in a canoe, it's good for you. Instead of having that as the background theme underneath, what you have is the 10 and the 15. Love of humanity and the potential love of oneself, but most important of all, behavior. You see, the 10th gate looks at the obsession of the 36 and says, ooh, is that me? So there is a basic conflict here, and this is the crisis. The crisis is a result of the behavior. And one of the things that happens is that because this is a 4-1, so it's going to be very fixed, what you're going to see in this is that these are people that study sex. The Masters and Johnsons type. They're great at studying sex and everybody else's crisis. But the moment that they go for it, boy, do they have a problem. When you come to the left angle and you come to the transpersonal, remember that whenever you're changing geometries, you're changing the way in which a person who's coming in on that cross is going to be able to deal with another human being. If you're coming in with the right angle, you know that they're self-absorbed, that it's not through the other that they're going to get clear, it is through themselves and their own process. And when you're dealing with a left angle being, you're dealing with somebody that naturally must align with somebody else. This is not selfish sexuality. This is not, I need to do it in a canoe. This is, should we, or can we, or will we do that in the canoe? In other words, it's transpersonal. There is a joining in that makes the experience possible. In saying that, the left angle cross of the plane is that the cross of the plane is the recognition that there must be a way to find a balance between those two forces that guide our life. In other words, we need to be able to survive, and we need to be able to survive in a collective order. That's the 10, that's the 15. We need to have the behavior to be able to survive in a collective order, in the collective flow, and at the same time, be able to satisfy this deep animal sexual need that is within us, to have those experiences that are exciting. The joke in that is that what comes out of that is, trying to sell people on the fact that the excitement that you have in the moment that you meet somebody is enough. In other words, fulfill your 36-6 demand. In other words, you can't make love to somebody that doesn't excite you. That's what the formula says. The formula says they have to be exciting. So what happens to these people living on the plane is that they have to find this balance. They have to find the right behavior and at the same time still be able to fulfill their sexuality. Not necessarily easy, particularly when you get to the 6th line. Because when you get to the 6th line and you get to the very end of the left angle process, when you get to the 6-3 profile, you get to this. I know several people who have this. And it's really something to watch them. Because, of course, what their process is that they go into one, they get totally burnt by that one, then they rush to the other one, and that falls apart. In other words, it just, it is this endless turmoil of trying to come to grips and trying to bring these two things together. The secret in all of that is that the cross of the plane demands intimacy. It demands intimacy. It is transpersonal. And that the only thing that makes this work is by entering into a relationship correctly. That the moment that somebody carrying this enters into the world correctly, they're going to be able to find the integration of those two forces in their life. In other words, they're going to get the right kind of partner in which the behavior that they have, in which the way they can fit into the collective flow, is not placed in crisis by their intimate needs and their desires. The cross of the plane. All of that coming out of that right angle beginning in Eden. You can see this movement as it goes. You have to be pushed out. You have to get into the sexuality. You get into the fixed crisis, and then you try to find a way through the other to get the balance in all of that. We've looked at the first cycle of 8 gates. Half of this quarter of Alcyone, of this quarter of initiation. Now think about this. When we're looking at each of these crosses, what we're looking at is that there are these thousands, millions of variations of people who are all carrying this information. The most primitive aspects of our genetic program are still inside of ourselves. And the most primitive aspects of our total program in that sense is still part of our lives. What we're looking at as we move through this cross of initiation, this quarter of initiation, and what you will see is that tomorrow when we look at the next 8, that there is a basic difference within the first 16. There's this basic difference between the two groupings of 8. And you'll see this transition from the very primitive, and you'll begin to see how it begins to mature, and slowly it gets ready to enter into the next quarter that will bring the civilizing phenomena that we'll look at later. So we have a genetic progression that's taking place. We've looked at the first section of it. I just want to take you back a step for a moment before I get you back into the rhythm of going through these crosses. I want to give you a sense again of the transition that takes place between what we're calling right angle and what is left angle. If you take a look at these illustrations, what you're looking at is, if you look over here, you're going to see that there's the 45th gate, and you can see it's the third line. That's the personality sun. And if you go back over here at the design, you're going to see that the design sun is in the 5th. That is, that's somebody that has a 3-5 profile. Now, profile is always starts with the line of the personality sun. So if your personality sun's in the 3rd line, your design sun in the 5th line, your 3-5 profile. Now look at that very carefully. One of the things you'll see is if you look beside the gate numbers, the 22, you'll see the block there that says 100%. This is from the computer program. And what that 100% is telling you is that it's telling you that the sun is right at the very, very end, the design sun, right at the very end of that 5th line. In other words, it's gone through 100% of that line, so it's right on the cusp, it's right on the edge. Now look what happens. You can see over here, up there, we've got this 86%. The moment that the personality sun gets to 87% of a line, in other words, the moment it moves through that arc of that line, that 56 minutes and 15 seconds, the moment that it moves through 87% of that, what happens is that the design sun has shifted, and it's shifted and changed lines. So we have exactly the same personality. We have the same 45 as an example. We've got the same 45, we've got the same 26. But what's happened is that at the design level, this is because of the 88 degrees, at the design level, what's happened is that the line has shifted, and so we have a shifting of a cross. We go from the 3-5, now we have a 3-6. This is the place of change. I talked about yesterday how in the traditional I Ching there are changing lines, and what we call these changing lines in the context of a cross is that we are calling them, these are changing crosses. And you can see that we have two kinds of crosses. We have a foundation cross that makes up 87% of the line, and then we have a changing cross that lasts 13%. Here in this illustration, you get to see the basic difference. Here, for example, the personality sun being in the 45th gate, what we can see here is that we have 7 variations that are right angle. We have 7 variations that are right angle because if you look at the configuration here of the 2247 and the 4526, you will notice in the configuration of the wheel, they're exactly 16 hexagrams apart. In other words, they look graphically as if they are a pure right angle. But when you get to the 4th line, the 45-4, and you get to the 87% place in that 4th line, what happens is that the unconscious has to change because in the 7th right angle cross, it's a 6th line, and when it comes to juxtaposition, it has to change to a 1st line, which means the gates themselves change. Here you have a movement of the other arm, the design arm, and it's no longer right angle. If you were to count the space between the 45 and the 36, you'll see that you're going to end up with not 4 equal parts. They disappear because you no longer have a right angle, you have a left angle cross. The other thing to consider is that as I'm taking you through, what I'm showing you is the archetype for the position of the sun. In each gate, I'm showing you the 3 archetypal configurations. In other words, I'm generalizing the right angle. You know, I can be relatively specific with the juxtaposition, it's simply 1, and I'm generalizing again about the left angle. But remember that there are deep, deep nuances. Not all right angles are alike. And not all right angles that are going to have their personality sun in 45 are alike. They will have the general theme of what I'm giving you, but they will live out that general theme depending on their profile. A 1-3 is very different from a 2-4. The investigative martyr, the 1-3, is going to operate thematically different than the 2-4 that's the hermit opportunist. Yet they're all going to operate within the context of what it is to be right angle in relationship to that theme. We come to the second grouping of 8 hexagrams in the first quarter of initiation. And we come to the 25th hexagram, the hexagram of innocence. And here we come to the vessel of love. Now think about the way this works in every single quarter. Every single quarter begins with a cross of the Sphinx. In the middle of that quarter, you get the vessel of love. And at the end of that quarter, you get the cross of the four ways. In other words, each quarter is structured the same way, however, with different variations, obviously, of those crosses. Here we're dealing with the first variation of the right angle cross of the vessel. The image of the vessel of love. You know, when you think about the vessel of love, and you think about the four gates of love, look at it this way. The 15th gate, which is the love of humanity, it is the aura itself. And if you can imagine a container, this is the outside of a container. And if you get to the 46th gate, which is the love of the body, in the 46th gate, what you have is the actual form of the container itself. That is the inside structure of it. The 10th gate, the gate of behavior, this is the lip. If you're looking at this container and you want to pour it, you're going to pour it out of the 10th gate. And what you're going to pour is the 25. The 25 is the blood. It is universal love. And the 25th gate has an extraordinary aspect to it. If you look at the design of forms, all the various forms and their designs, one of the things you'll see is that there is a design for all inanimate objects. And all inanimate objects have simply one gate out of one center. Remember, to be alive, there must be a channel. There is no channel in the inanimate. Yet every single inanimate object has its basic format, its basic matrix, a G center with an open 25th gate. Love. This is the coolest of love. And one of the things to recognize about those that come in on the vessel of love, and they come in with the sun in innocence, is that they are here. In the old days, we would have seen them as priests and priestesses. They are the ones that are taking us into cosmic love, into the larger love. Yet at a personal level, they have difficulty because this is the coolest love. This is a love that says that I love this machine as much as my child, which can be quite annoying to some people. Yes, I do love my guitar more than you. Universal love is like that. It has nothing to do with, hot love. It's simply very cool. It takes in everything. Someone who comes in on the cross of the vessel, because this is forearms that is always having to do with love, that love is the biggest question in their life. To be loved, to know love. And remember, the fact that somebody has the cross of the vessel doesn't mean that they have definition in the G center. You can have those that desperately seek love, but it's always being conditioned by other forces. But coming in on this cross, the children that come in on this cross, they must be fully embraced. Because love is what is going to matter to them. And if you're looking for a nice kind of smiley cross, this one is it. The cross of the vessel is the only way to balance the Sphinx. The Sphinx is hard. The road is hard. And relative perception leads to all kinds of problems. Love is its balance. And remember something about the nature of love that is coming out of the G center. It is not sexual. It has nothing to do with sex, which makes it a different kind of love entirely. When I worked with gays in Germany years ago, in Hamburg and Berlin, it was one of the things that was most noticeable, was that the real connection was always through the G center. It was always through this different kind of love that's possible. And so these are very important forces that balance us in the world between the pressure that it takes to move through life, to try to survive, to go through what the program has shown us up to now, which is very basic stuff. You know, to be ready to defend ourselves, to be ready to kill, to feed ourselves, to find communion, to be taken over by our needs for sexuality and our needs for food and pleasure. And one of the things you'll notice in that first 8 hexagrams is that so much of that is in the emotional system. It all starts with the emotional system. That's why it's going to close with the emotional system finally waking up. It begins with that, begins with the need for food and sex and pleasure and all of those things that are there in the emotional system. But here, you come back to the G center and you come back to purity. You come back to innocence in that sense. The 25th gate and the vessel of love, when the theme is operating through the sun in the 25, this is those who come into love and who are shocked and often broken in love. Their whole dynamic is that they're going to be pointing this whole cross towards what they don't have. That is the 51, which is the harmonic to the sun in the 25. And they're going to meet shock in their process. In meeting that shock, one of the things that happens to them is that they can feel totally lost. That is, that they can never have love, that they can never hold on to love, that love is taken away from them. When you get to the 4th line and you get to that last 87%, so that you're going to have the shift of the design underneath, you're going to move from the design earth being in, design sun earth being in the 10 and the 15, and it's going to be replaced by the sun in the 58, design sun, and the design earth in the 52. This is the juxtaposition cross of innocence. Now look, the 58-1. The 58-1 is the most beautiful line of the 384 lines. It's the love of life. It's the energy just to love being in the world. It's beautiful energy. And one of the things to be clear about in this juxtaposition cross is that this juxtaposition cross is, obsessed is not the right word, is driven to enjoy love and life. They're driven. Now look, because somebody enjoys, it's going to sound odd, because somebody enjoys love and life doesn't necessarily mean they're happy. You know, this is one of the things about individuality. You know, I mean, I have a great life, you know, but I can be sad as hell. I mean, individuality is what it is. It is a melancholy that's there, and the theme here is still being held by the personality sun in the 25. So there's a real dilemma for these. They're fixed on, you know, I'm sure that hedonism was invented or created, you know, by somebody who came in on this cross. It's like, okay, let's really just enjoy life. Now, the beauty of this cross is what it leads to. Because what it leads to is the only cross that's about healing. You know, this pursuit, you know, the pursuit of happiness. Eh? This pursuit is inherent here, but it's very, very, very fixed. What happens is that the moment that it becomes transpersonal, the moment that it becomes a karmic interaction, then you get healing. It's not about my happiness. It's not about my trip. It's about, I can make you happy. Remember, these are priests. These are priestesses. See, we have 3 ways of power in design. We have the 2145, which is the way of power through the tribe and its traditional rulership through territory. We have collective leadership through the 31-7, what has become our basic democratic way of dealing with authority and electing or selecting authority, in which the people ultimately hold the power. And then we have the mystical way. We have another kind of authority. We have another kind of leadership that takes the tribe out of its tight little corner and drags it to the abyss and throws it into the void. So this is the role here of the 25. So this juxtaposition cross of influence, remember, fourth line personalities are enormously influential. They're the fixed ones. You know, my favorite black humor, you know, they're the French missionaries boiling in a Mohawk pot, you know, and they're still singing the praises of Jesus. Now you can't do that unless you're fourth line. Otherwise, you're screaming, you're upset, you know. Fourth line, fixed in their way, singing the praises as they bubble and boil. It really impressed the Mohawks, by the way. No, I'm serious. It impressed them. You know, usually they put somebody in a pot and they're really a mess. You know, they struggle, they scream, they cry, they pray, they do all these things, you know. There was these missionaries, you know, standing, you know, upright, boiling away, you know, singing the praises of Jesus. They thought that was great. They didn't become Christians. However, they were, you know. Okay, so you get the picture. These people are going around trying to influence you, and they're trying to influence you to feel really good about the nature of life. Okay, so when you get to the transpersonal here, you get to the left angle cross of healing. Now that begins with the 25-5. Now the 25-5 is actually the only line of all 384 lines that deals with healing specifically, and in that language. This is a combination of universal love and the love of the body, brought together with this need for the joy of life, but the energy to correct, and the ability to be focused in that correction. Those that come in on the left angle cross of healing, they are here to heal or be healed. And normally what you find in this cross is what keeps the pharmaceutical industry going, which is vast, broad-scaled hypochondria. You see, the 58th gate, despite the fact that it loves life, is still part of the channel of judgment and a design of dissatisfaction. And it is always looking for something to correct, otherwise it wouldn't be a very good healer. You see, people who start off sickly tend to want to be healers. There's an enormous vulnerability on this cross. And there's a vulnerability on this cross that opens up these people to being ill and needing others to heal them. And in being healed, being turned on to being healers themselves. One of the things to recognize about the nature of healing is that no one can be healed without being awake spiritually within themselves. That's the theme of the sun in the 25th gate. You know, it's one of the most important things that we do in terms of human design and health. When we talk about the relationship between practitioners and their clients or patients, that to be able to get them to respond according to their type, to be able to involve them according to their type, that you're going to have human beings that are going to get better quicker. So one of the things to recognize here inherently in the nature of healing, it's not just the energy, it's not just the recognition that life is terrible without health. I mean, that's what this cross says, and this is what this cross advertises in the world. Life is a drag if you're not healthy. It's better to be healthy and poor than to be rich and sick. You know, this is one of those things. So this cross, this healing cross, please understand something. Though it's the cross of healing, it's most often the cross of being sick, and particularly amongst children. When you look at the quarter of initiation, the only definition that comes out of those 16 gates is the 25 and the 51, channel of initiation. It gives its name, in that sense, to this very quarter. And it says something essential. It says, look, we've got all this stuff. We started off, we've got all the tools, we've got the equipment, we've got everything else. We have our sex life, we have our genetic reproduction so that we can keep everything going. We got places to go so that we can keep on conquering. We have all of that, but, we have to have our health in order to maintain that. And you see, there's a real transition that's taking place here the moment you leave the first 8 gates of this initiating quarter and you move into the second. The second has something else going for it. It's saying, look, wait a minute. There are other things that are going to matter to us. It's not just going to be life. It's going to be, pardon me if I sound California, it's going to be quality of life. So quality of life becomes a big deal when you get into this next 8 hexagrams, and that begins with the 25 that says, yes, I have my woman and I have my hut and I have everything else, but I can't walk on these legs. Health becomes something very important, and it does something else. It does something else. You see, we're designed to get sick, which means that there are others that are designed to take power because we are sick. If you look at the people, if you look at workers in America, whose only job is to deal with those that are ill in one way or another, boy, you got a lot of people. It's a big, bloody industry. So, this is a power trip. Now, remember something. There's something very funny here, because after all, the genetics don't change as fast as the civilization, obviously. And when you go back to this time, what you're looking here in the 25 is that you're looking at both the shaman, that is, you're looking at the spiritual guide, but the spiritual guide is also the medicine man. In other words, what you're looking at there is that you're looking at the original combination of what a healer was. The healer had to be part priest, and it had to be part doctor. And of course, what comes out of this 25 and its emergence, though it sounds all lovey-dovey, all this love, and everything should be sweet, and everything should be nice, and let's have a good life, and it's going to be rich and wonderful, out of that comes the recognition, oh boy. See, in the beginning, when you only lived 15 or 16 years, didn't matter. And we didn't live very long for a very, very, very long time. So it wasn't like, you either died when you were born or you died when you were 15 or 16. It took a long time to get to 30. You were living in a highly competitive, dangerous environment. So one of the things to recognize about this is that this is the beginning of a whole new authority structure rooted in mind. Remember, this quarter is about mind and the establishment of the mental Maya plane. This is the authority of experts. Now, a friend of mine in Ibiza used to say, expert? That's somebody who used to be pert. And I thought, well, yes. Anyway, so you have new kinds of authority. It's no longer the authority of the tribal chieftain or the bully or whatever the case may be. There's another kind of authority that's emerging out of this. And it's an authority that says, I can heal you. I can make you feel better. And of course, that was a very, very powerful thing because disease was there. And they had to wake up to the recognition that disease got in the way of the pleasure of life. And so you have a whole new aspect of human culture that develops. Out of this comes incredible things. The whole educational process that we would eventually embrace, all of these things are rooted in this initiation out of the 25th gate. When we move then from the 25, we go directly into the 17th gate. We go into the Ajna center. And we go into the logical side of the mind, and the 17th gate is the gate of opinions. Now, what's very interesting about this, just as a sidebar, is that it's here genetically that we begin to wonder about time. In other words, this is the beginning of trying to grasp time. Now, of course, that all begins with the fact that through the 25th gate and what it brings, we discover that we're terminal. We realize that we're going to die. And in realizing that we're going to die, rather than that it's going to be fun to make life, in realizing that we're going to die, we want to live longer. We get into that whole business of trying to last longer, all of that stuff, and we get caught up in the whole time business. So the 17 comes. Now remember that the 17 is here to organize us. And you go from the cross of healing, a left angle transpersonal cross, into the right angle cross of service. This is the 17 and the 18, the 58 and the 52. You cannot get a more logical cross. All four gates are logical. This is not about service in the sense that anybody coming in on this cross, they are not necessarily humanitarians. After all, they have no choice. They are right angle. They are self-absorbed. They feel good doing their work. That doesn't mean that the feel good comes from providing the service. They feel good from what they do. The fact that somebody else may benefit from that may be wonderful and valuable, but that's not where they get their satisfaction. The other thing about this is that this is about correction. So this is the first great cross of bitching. And people who come in on this cross will bitch incessantly because, of course, they want to be of service. Let me tell you what's wrong with you, with your life, with the world, with just about everything. We have a definition here in this right angle cross. That is the definition between the 1858. So what you know is that those who come in on this cross are deeply dissatisfied. They bring dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction leads to service. The 17th gate is the way mentally in which we begin to organize ourselves, and this is the root of what we will ultimately be able to call philosophy. It is out of the 17th gate that we establish opinions. It's out of the 17th gate that we begin the conceptual process of trying to organize humanity. And that the 17th gate is always seeking out detail. And in seeking out detail, you can see that this theme of seeking out detail, this is something that's following naturally the discovery of how fragile we are in this life. That we do need protection in this life, that we are going to need healing in this life, and that the detail is going to be important. The investigation of things is going to be important. Because it's a cross of service, it looks like this is very, very productive. And obviously it can be. However, again, you have to see that, if it's the not self that's carrying this cross, what you're going to have is a lot of dissatisfaction. You're going to have a deep sense of, the world is not right. Now remember something. Somebody that has a defined splenic center is not going to be the ideal healer. It's very important to grasp that. So when you're looking at a cross that has a definition that is a cross of service, it's not that these people are healers. They're not healers. But they can be of service. They can point you in the right direction, organize the environment so that perhaps healing can be possible. But what you'll find at the mundane level is if you know anybody who's come in on this cross, that they are always, this is a great whining cross. Nothing is right and nothing is working. When you get to the juxtaposition, you have a very important transition that's taking place. That is, the 58 and the 52, these root aspects of the logical circuitry, they disappear and they're replaced with the 38 and the 39. Now, first of all, the 38-39 is individual. These are twin gates in the root center, and they both represent very, very provocative energy. That is, the 38th gate is the gate of the fighter, the 39th gate is the gate of opposition, this is the gate of the provocateur. And so you're dealing with very strong individual energy, and as you will see, that 38-39 will eventually become the basis of the right angle cross of tension. So it brings a great deal of adrenal pressure with it. That juxtaposition is the juxtaposition cross of opinions. These people are truly an enormous pain in the butt. I want you to understand what a 17 opinion is like if it doesn't have a 62. The 17 says it's only going to take 5 minutes to get to the course. They arrive 35 minutes late. You see, they have no sense of time. That's why they're fascinated with time. But they have no sense of time. Time to them is like, well, they don't really know how it moves. They're just fascinated by it. So think about what that's like. You've got somebody, they have an opinion, but the opinion has no detail. There's no consistent detail. And they're fixed. So what that means is that they always must put their opinion out. Now remember something about fourth line beings. Fourth line beings are a great test of your awareness. You either love them or you let them go. Because you see, you cannot do anything with them. Remember, they're the priest in the pot. What are you going to do with them? They're giving you this opinion. In 5 minutes I'm going to be ready. They'll tell you that for 30 years. They're rigid in the pot, And the fact that they discover after 30 years that when they say they'll be ready in 5 minutes, that it's never like that, doesn't change them saying that. Because they can't do anything about it. See, what grace it is to know that we come in that way. And it's okay. It's not like none of their opinions work. Some of those opinions are really sharp. After all, that's what they're here for. But they're constantly giving you their opinion. So look, if you disagree with them, that's okay. But you can't argue with them. You see, the whole thing about meeting a fourth line force is that if you do want to fight with them, it's to the death. There is no other way. You either break them or you leave them alone. And if you break them like Humpty Dumpty, you're not going to have an easy job of putting all that back together again. Now look what happens when this becomes transpersonal. After all, when you're dealing with the juxtaposition, it's just a fixed fate. It's their own line, But the moment that you step into the left angle, you step into the transpersonal where that's got to be moved back and forth. And what do you have? You have the left angle cross of upheaval. Growing up in Canada, Canadians have some wonderful expressions. My favorite is shit disturber. I would have liked to have called this cross the left angle cross of shit disturbing. Because that's what these people are like. They muck around in things. They push buttons. These are the great button pushers. The old elevator operators, they used to stand there and hit the buttons for it. These are the button pushers. They know. They create more tension than any other cross on the planet. That's their job. They just stick the finger in the pie. And of course, the whole thing about that is that underneath that, if you look at the beginning of this left angle, because the left angle here, the two variations of fifth and sixth lines are very interesting. If you look at the fifth line, the 18.5 is the only line that has to do with therapy. 384 lines, only one line has to do with therapy. That fifth line is either you're going to be ultimately a therapist or you're going to be somebody totally dependent on therapy. One or the other. You're either the mental patient, or you're helping the mental patient. So what you're looking at here is that cross of upheaval can be very, very disturbing. It overturns things. These are people that can be very disturbed in that sense. But they're always deeply, deeply provocative. And when you get to that fifth line where you're dealing with projection, it's other people that are always projecting on these people that they're going to make trouble. So you could actually call this the left angle cross of Jonah. Because it also gets that reputation. That reputation that, they bring bad luck or they bring misfortune. Simply because they shift things around. Shit disturbing is healthy. You come into a town like Sedona where most people are waiting to die. It's nice to stir things around a bit, wake them up, It's not like, whenever you look at any of these configurations, please recognize you're looking at genetic aspects of the whole. People who are living out those aspects, they're living out a necessary component of the totality. Our petty moralities don't mean anything in the face of that. We might not like people who are provocateurs who come into our lives and disturb our little status quo. However, they can be of great value. Now, of course, in saying that, it's always nice to make them sound better, right? In saying that, the vast majority of humanity lives the not self. You meet one of these characters as a not self, and it's not all that pleasant. Because what they are provoking, what they are turning over, what they are impacting on. Yeah. Oh, the sixth line of this, that's the sweetest thing, because the sixth line of this is the 18.6 at the personality earth. The 18.6 is Buddhahood. Now, the 18th gate, of course, is an Oedipus Electra gate. So, of course, all of these people that come in with 18th gates, they all have their problems with mama and papa. But on top of that, if you come in with the sixth line is about being spoiled. It's about being spoiled. In other words, those that come in on the cross of upheaval, they are only allowed to muck around in the lives of those who allow them to. Oh, please come and make a mess out of my life. Please come and disturb my life. It's okay. Oh, aren't you cute the way you do that? Now we get down to serious business. See, the sun moves into the 21st gate, and everybody starts goose-stepping, biting through. The gate of control, the gate of needing to be in control, the gate of the hunter and the huntress, the president, the leader of the tribe. And when we get to the 21st gate, we have the Sun-Earth 2148 with the design Sun-Earth 3839. This is the right angle cross of tension. One of the things that vanity gets in the way of is the acceptance of hierarchy. You can see right from the beginning the way we're designed, right from the moment that you can see the cross of dominion and you can see that usurpation is part of our process, that you can see that there's a deep drive within humanity to compete for hierarchical levels. In other words, the rising up and how everyone wants to look at that rising up. There's always some kind of resistance in that sense to hierarchies. This name, cross of tension, simply comes with the baggage of being a natural leader. And the baggage of being a natural leader means that in order to maintain that authority, one must be on guard and one must have control. Without that control, usurpation is always possible. Without that control, the tribe may not function properly. And if the tribe doesn't function properly, it's the leader that has to take the blame. That pressure to be the ruler, to be the leader in that sense, is where the root of this tension is. Now, one of the things to understand about that is that the opposite of the 21st gate is the 48. Now, the 48th gate is the gate of depth. That the real capacity to be able to be the leader of the tribe is rooted in the need for depth. It's also cute to notice that the 48th gate is the gate of black magic. It's nice to have your tricks, your backdoor politics, your slush funds, your ba-ba-ba, whatever the case may be, your bullies in the back room. Now, the difficult aspect for those that come in on this cross is that they feel that in their body. And so they have tension in their body. These are people that need to have their bodies worked on and worked on a lot. These are people that need regular massage. These are people that need to work on their body. It's very, very important for them. Because this tension, which is a field of energy out of their cross, this tension permeates their body. Now, one of the interesting things about them is that the way in which they release tension is by provoking. That's how they get their tension out. They pass it on to somebody else. Now, of course, when that's right angle, that's not so nice. I mean, after all, they're getting it out to help themselves, if you know what I mean. They're putting that tension out with the other. Now, we can look at that, if you take the morality, you can say, well, that's terrible, it's not very nice, blah, blah, blah. But of course, there is the other side of that. That cross of tension is necessary, because without the tension, there is no way to maintain authority over the tribe. The tribe needs to have that sense that if they don't do something right, somebody's going to punish them. And the first thing that you get out of the arrival of the 21st gate, oh my God, it's going to be on tape and I will hear about this, is the police. Because that's what you get out of the 21st gate. You see, you get the recognition that there has to be control. And there has to be control, and there has to be enforcement of control. And so that provocation and that tension leads to enforcement, and leads to enforcement that says, I'm in control, do as I say, or do as you're supposed to do, or so forth and so on. It's interesting the way things work. Right? See, human beings, it's built into our program. Wherever you look on this planet, there are these creatures in uniform that carry weapons. It doesn't matter where you look. They're all over the place, And it's not like we necessarily wanted that or we needed that. It's built into us genetically. That role is there. There's somebody always standing there keeping us all in line. We're genes on a chromosome. Standing there, stay in line. So we get our police force. If you want to see that at its extreme, you go to the juxtaposition. Because in the juxtaposition, you get something else entirely. What disappears is the provocation, the 38-39. And what comes in its place is the 54 and the 53, the sun in 54, the design earth in 53. Now, the 54th gate is the marrying maiden, and it's a gate of ambition. And so one of the things about this juxtaposition cross of control is that this is the way these people fulfill their ambition, their need to rise up. And they fulfill their need to rise up by constantly demanding to be in control. And they're fixed in that. And again, if you try to block that control, you can stop them in that sense, but you can never change that drive of theirs to be recognized and be in control. Now, one of the things that's interesting about them is that they take control to try to start new things. This is their drive. In other words, what they really represent is that they represent a kind of transition process, a transition process that says, wait a minute, it's not about controlling what we have. It's about setting up something totally new, and I have to control that in order for that new thing to succeed. So in many ways, this cross brings innovation. However, if you live with this person, have a nice time. Unless you're into the M in S&M, I was being a little harsh. When you get to the transpersonal and you get to the left angle cross, you get to the left angle cross of endeavor. These are very important agents. And basically what they are is that they are agents for change. This is about launching into new things. And you can see that its natural root came out of the juxtaposition. In other words, what happens to the juxtaposition cross is because they can't necessarily have control over what already exists, they find something new to develop that they can control. And by the time you step here into the left angle, here you can see it becomes a cooperative process. In other words, it gets closer to what its real tribal nature is because it's transpersonal. So what you get out of this cross of endeavor is that you get all kinds of new enterprises in that sense that are controlled enterprises that human beings enter into. For example, we have a worldwide endeavor to map the human genome. It's that kind of thing in which this cross can become instrumental. In other words, bringing forces together, and in bringing those forces together, bring them together in a controlled environment in order to get to some goal. For example, the American effort to go to the moon. That's a classic example of this kind of configuration, in which you bring forces together, yet they have to be tightly controlled. In other words, this is not allowing the mad scientists in their basement. This is about developing communal structures in which there's somebody controlling that direction and opening up some new area. That brings us to the 51st gate, the arousing, shock, thunder. This is the bookend to the 25. The 2551 formed this definition within this quarter. And that the 51st gate is a gate of shock. It is an ego gate. Its biological relationship is to the gallbladder. This is where gall is. And in this right angle cross, we have the right angle cross of penetration, the 51, the 57, the 54, and the 53. And that's exactly what they do. They penetrate you. That's what they're here for. And they penetrate you in many, many different ways. They can shock you. They can penetrate you through the depth of their intuition. They can penetrate you by getting you to notice them. And they can penetrate things by opening up what's new and starting things. This is a very dynamic force, this right angle cross of penetration. Remember that, the 51st gate with the sun here in the 51st gate, in this example of this cross, it's very Aryan here. That is, we are in Aries as a position within Aries. The 51st gate is a classic Aryan gate. So what you're dealing with is, very rudimentary beginnings, but very deep penetration. Whenever you're dealing with individuality in a cross, you know that it is a cross that is mutative. And every time that you see individual gates in a cross, recognize that those people carrying that cross, they represent mutative agents. So the cross of penetration is a mutative cross. That shock that they inadvertently, remember that they are right angle, that shock that they inadvertently bring to somebody may be enormously valuable to that person who is taken in that experience. However, that was not the intent of the right angle. They are absorbed in their own process, after all. You can see the transition here because the moment that you move to the juxtaposition, you get something very unusual taking place. First of all, the 54-53 disappears. It's replaced with the 61 and the 62. The 61-1, which is occult knowledge. And here you have the juxtaposition cross of shock. These are people that shock you with the detail. They shock you with their knowing. They simply shock you. And by the way, whether they know anything or not, whether it's truth or not, they don't care. They like to shock. So that's the many years ago in Spain when Chernobyl blew up in Russia. There was all this fallout that went over Central Europe. And it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like people were dropping dead. But there was this flood of people coming down to the island to get away from all of that. And there were these people that were, they would say things like, 800 cows died yesterday just outside of whatever. And of course, it was never true. And this is, this is how you shock with detail. They just love to shock. Now, sometimes they will shock you with the truth, but there's no guarantee of that. What they're doing is they're shocking. I'm sure the punk movement began with somebody with this juxtaposition. They spike up their heads and, just shock for the sake of shock. Now, of course, that's great. I mean, after all, human beings are so bloody serious and complacent. Every once in a while, it's really nice to go, bang. When you get to the left angle, you get to the left angle cross of the Clarion. The 51, the 57, the 61, and the 62. They try to shock you with the news, because that's basically what they do. But being a Clarion is basically a public job. In other words, what their role is transpersonally is it's to bring shock to those who have been waiting for the shock. It's very different from the juxtaposition who has the gift of the shock for the shock's sake. But the moment that it becomes transpersonal, there is a karma involved. So those that are shocked by the left angle cross of the Clarion, they've been waiting for the shock. That's me, that's my cross. And I've known that through the thousands of readings that I've done. That it's incredibly rare that somebody comes in and they're not ready to be shocked. That's part of it. It's part of our bargain together. And it's an unseen, unknown bargain because it's simply in the way in which we're structured. But shock is what it's about. So this is about the making noise. The Clarion comes with sound. So there's always this noise, blah, 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 that comes with all of that. Eh? Mutation. When you look at this cross, 3 of the 4 gates are mutative gates. And of course, because there are those that are waiting for the shock, they're waiting for the mutation. That is, they're open to the mutation. It's one of the fascinating things that we've discovered about the way in which aspects of the brain work, in which you have these lock and key phenomena, in which you have receptors that are sitting there that are waiting for something exactly that will fit into that. And of course, that's one of the things that happens in the mutative process. That is, if you're waiting to be shocked, you're carrying within you the potential to accept that mutation. Not everybody can be mutated. There are those you will see who are totally resistant to mutation. I've met them, I know. And there are those who have just a natural receptivity to being mutated. And it's one of the inherent bargains that always exists whenever you're looking at any kind of left angle phenomena. I always used to have people say to me, well, you seduced me. And I used to say, yes, but you wanted me to. This is the lock and the key. It is the way that it works, and that's part of what is the left angle phenomena. So, very important to see here that when you're dealing with the cross of penetration, people are not prepared for the shock. They're not prepared, they're just being penetrated. They suddenly recognize they're being penetrated. You get the juxtaposition who says, hey, shocking is great, let's just shock. And then finally you get to the left angle that says, I'm only going to shock those that are ready for my shocking. And of course, it's not like they make that decision. It's just that they end up shocking those that are ready to be shocked.
Well, hello, and welcome to all of you, which is